The next phase in diplomatic negotiations over Ukraine, balancing Russian concerns about NATO missiles targeting Moscow with German worries over energy security and the EU calculating the cost of war on its territory. Failure to avoid military confrontation would mean massive losses on all sides. I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's Newsmakers, the cost of conflict in Eastern Europe. While threats and rhetoric have increased steadily, all parties know the realities of an armed conflict are too grim to ignore. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelensky is acutely aware of a war's potential consequences as his country becomes a stage of sorts where world powers can flex their muscle, not least Russia and the United States. But the Kremlin also knows there is only so much it can push back before its maneuvering is seen as an act of aggression. NATO missiles stationed within easy striking distance of Moscow are an uncomfortable reality, but so is the cost of an armed conflict that pits Russia against much of the Western world. And Moscow is also thinking hard about possible long-term strategies of NATO expansion.
Do you understand it or not? If Ukraine would be in NATO and tries to retake Crimea militarily, European countries will be automatically drawn into a military conflict with Russia. Of course, NATO's armament potential and Russia's are not comparable, and we understand that. But we also understand that Russia is one of the leading nuclear powers and ahead of many countries in its modernity. There will be no winners.
For Europe, it's a question of how far it can afford to march in lockstep with Washington over a conflict that it can well do without. The economic and energy security needs of major European powers, including France and Germany, are too critical to set aside. German leadership has set itself an ambitious and transformative energy agenda. War with Russia over Ukraine would be a major setback to its energy and economic interests. But in Washington, those consequences were underplayed.
The energy mix today, we're talking about 1/4 of our energy that is linked to gas. And only part of that gas comes from Russia. A big part comes from Norway or the Netherlands. And of course, it's very important to us that we develop an infrastructure that will give us the opportunity to have all options available and react if needed. So you don't have to be concerned. There are some who should be concerned, who see themselves maybe too much as a deliverer of such resources. Because we're focusing on renewable energies, we will go down that path and make sure that this is the profitable future.
And Ankara is advantageously positioned to understand the price that all sides will have to pay. President Erdogan's diplomatic initiatives are aimed at a successful de-escalation at the least opportunity cost.
As I have reiterated many times, Turkey is ready to do its share in order to ease the tensions in the region. As the Turkish Republic, we are a country in the Black Sea region. During our talks, I have once again underlined the fact that we're ready to host bilateral talks in the region. So, as the Republic of Turkey, we are acting with the understanding of easing the tensions rather than adding fire to military escalation.
So, to look at the many elements involved in attempts to de-escalate this crisis today, I'm joined from Brussels by historian and Russian affairs analyst Gilbert Doctorow. He also wrote the recently published Russia in the Turbulent 1990s, Diaries, Memoirs, and Documents. Dana Lewis joins us from London. He's a journalist, political analyst, and host of the podcast Backstory. And from Moscow is Sergei Markov, a professor in the political science faculty at the Moscow State Institute of International Relations. Thanks all so much for being with us. Dana, let me start with you, because you said about a month ago that one should be very careful about using the phrase when Russia invades, because there is still a lot to talk about. There is still room for negotiation and for compromise. Do you think that point has really been proven now, especially over the last week?
I'm not sure. I mean, I would like to say that, as long as there's political dialogue, there's hope. hope for the best, prepare for the worst. And the problem is that while this dialogue is taking place, whether it be through the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken, or whether it be through French President Macron, or whether it be through President Erdogan, the problem is that Russia continues to amass troops, and it has changed its capability on the Ukraine border to the extent that a lot of people who look, Andrea, at troop movements and look up at the makeup of those troops, both on the Ukraine border, on the eastern side, in the Crimea on the southern side, and the increasing number of troops in Belarus, think that all the cards seem to indicate that, yeah, there's dialogue, but Russia really looks ready to spring.
But Dana, you don't think the landscape has changed, with leaders like President Erdogan and President Macron stepping up and, in a sense, leaving the United States less in the lead?
Well, I think the U.S. is still in the lead. And I think that that's why you get Russia, the Kremlin, wanting to have very hot bilateral discussions with the U.S. Because in the end, so many of these issues will really depend on what America agrees to do. So I think that the U.S. is still the lead on this. Macron has just said now, as he's landed in Kiev after meeting with President Putin, that he has managed to freeze things. And he has obtained the promise from President Putin that there'll be no degradation nor escalation. But he hasn't given a time frame on that. And he's also said that there would not be a permanent placement of Russian troops in Belarus, and that President Putin has guaranteed him that they will leave after the military exercises take place on somewhere around February the 20th. Now, the Kremlin, Dmitry Peskov, the spokesman, has said today nobody ever said that they were going to stay, but he also did not confirm when they would leave.
Interesting. Gilbert, let me ask you if you agree with that take, that no matter what kind of positive diplomatic steps are taken, the bottom line is Russia continues to amass these troops on the border, and we really are in as precarious and dangerous as a position as ever.
I agree with the last statement you've made. The situation remains precarious, but the situation is also much more complex than the binary invade, no invade that we hear in the media, and we hear daily from the United States government and from the United Kingdom. There are many different gradations in between. There also is the issue that is not discussed at all. Under what circumstances the Russians would make a move on Ukraine. Making a move can be anything from a full-scale invasion, which is what the Biden administration likes to have as its favorite scenario to justify the sanctions from hell, down to targeted strikes, missile strikes, high aerial bombardment of military targets, such as all of the toys for boys that have been delivered by NATO countries in the last week. How would any of the countries that have said they are aligned with the United States on its sanctions policy, in fact, react if the scenario were anything other than the massive invasion? It's not the least bit clear, and that is buried away. The Russian options are very broad. And what is also not said is that very little of the likelihood or not of a military conflict depends on the civilian leadership in any of the countries that are a party to these discussions, including Mr. Putin. The fact remains that this is a tinderbox, that you have 130,000 Ukrainian troops, 2/3 of their total military force, who are at the border with Donbass and who have been there for, many of them, for 3 years or 4 years, facing down the forces of these rebel provinces at a distance of maybe 200 meters. And in violation of the Minsk Accords, all of these advanced heavy weaponry are right at the demarcation line. If there were to be a provocation that is sparked by any of the, for example, any of the hotheads, militias, the Azov division, from the Ukrainian forces, or sparked by the special forces detachments that the United States and the UK have traveling through this demarcation line area. It is outside the competence or the ability of the President of the United States or of the other leaders to prevent some kind of military activity.
Okay. Let me get the perspective then from Moscow quickly. Sergei, I mean, Gilbert asked the question, under what circumstances would Russia make a move? Russia has said it is not interested in invading Ukraine. But tell us what you're seeing on the ground from Moscow.
I think Russia has now two tasks, one minimum and one maximum. And both of the minimum and maximum goals should be reached, but in the different time. Minimum is peace and security for the people in Donbass. It means implementation of Minsk agreement. Everybody 100% knows that it's exactly Kiev repressive regime fully responsible for not implementation of Minsk agreement. They should be implemented. It's a Russian strong demand. If it's no, Russia will recognize Donetsk People Republic and Lugansk People Republic and build military alliance with them, exactly as with Abkhazia and South Ossetia, and how Turkey built alliance with Northern Republic of Northern Cyprus. And then Russian troops will enter this territory to protect these people from the Ukrainian forces. If Ukrainian army started its attack, Russian army will ready to protect Donbass and Lugansk and will crush Ukrainian army. It's minimum goal. Maximum goal, it means pacification of Ukraine. It means that few principles. Sovereignty should be back to Ukraine, and this puppet pro-American regime should be replaced. Then it should be denazification of Ukraine. It means all neo-Nazi groups, which include now almost 30,000 militants. And they should be disarmed. And also free and fair elections should be, and all political prisoners, thousands of political prisoners should be liberated.
Okay, let me, Sergei, I'm sorry to interrupt you, but I really saw Dana cringe at one point there in a sense. Dana, what did you so disagree with there?
Well, it's just, I mean, I agree with Sergei Markov on the idea that Russia could do and in fact, both your guests, other guests have said that it could be a limited movement by Russia. And I think probably that's the consensus in the West as well, that Russia doesn't intend to do a full invasion of Ukraine, that likely they will do something in the Donbass if there isn't some kind of implementation of the Minsk agreements. And that is I mean, we can go on for an hour about the problem with the Minsk agreements, but that is certainly a focus of the conversation. But Markov saying, I'm sorry, Sergei, you saying that this is an American puppet regime in Kiev is just a ridiculous notion. And I think if that is how it's processed in Russia, it's a very bad read of real Ukrainian nationalism and why they stood up to a puppet government that had been placed by Moscow in the first place.
But Dana, isn't that always, isn't that always the case?
Was placed there by Russia, supported by Russia, and that's why people turned against him. And the notion that if both sides hold this notion that one is a Western puppet government or one is a Kremlin puppet government, and that the people of Ukraine have no voice in any of this, I think we're really missing the show.
Sergei, I'll let you respond quickly. Go ahead.
No. Can you respond? Most of the, situation like this, when elections, majority of the Ukrainian people every time vote against fascists and to support pro-peace politicians, like Zelensky, for example. But when they take in the office, they immediately appear to be under the control of the outside players, such as United States, Great Britain, and another institution. And as a result, Vladimir Zelensky promised to fulfill Minsk agreement and to stop prohibition of the Russian language. But what he is doing, in fact, he violated Minsk agreement, not implement them, and continue the policy of prohibition of Russian language. Why? Why? Can you say me? If this his program of non-prohibition of Russian language,
Sergei Markov, you cannot say every time.
But he's doing contrary of this when he's in office. Why?
Go ahead quickly, Dana.
Well, the language issue, the language question is another issue. But the idea that every time
No,
that
it's
there's a
one
government in
question.
Kiev that wants to join the EU or wants to be part of NATO, that immediately they are puppets of somebody. I think that's just naive, and that's what that's the line being pushed by the Kremlin all the time.
I think both of your perspectives have been expressed here. Let me get Gilbert back in the conversation. Gilbert, do go ahead, and I wanted to ask you a more pointed question in a second. Go ahead, Gilbert.
Well, I don't think we have to speak about the Kiev administration being a puppet, at least of the United States. Although the United States' presence in Kiev is remarkably big. The American embassy in Kiev is the largest in Europe. It has 900 staff. And I think it's easy to understand that it is playing a role now in Kiev, very similar to the role that it played in the Yeltsin years in the 1990s in Russia, when its people penetrated ministries, Russian ministries, and had a very strong influence on policy. I don't think we have to call it a puppet, but it is an outsized presence and influence. At the same time, if Mr. Zelensky is a puppet of anybody, it's of the forces within his own country. His power to take decisions bearing on the crisis today is very circumscribed by the very same people who were behind the Maidan. They never went away. They have outsized importance. Called them neo-fascists, called them far-right. This is all debatable. We can get into semantics. The point, though, is that there are some very violent people and some very radical people who brought about the Maidan and who never went home to farm their backyards. They are calling the shots. And so Mr. Zelensky is a front person, well-meaning perhaps, but to say that he is deciding what is going on at the line of demarcation would be grossly wrong.
Okay. Gilbert, I have to ask you this because I think you need us to help us better understand kind of the bigger issue here, in that there's a question about how much Russia has already gotten much of what it wants in eastern Ukraine right now. I mean, the ruble is effectively the currency. They have militia backing them on the ground, Ukrainian militia. There are Ukrainian-Russian militia. There are some 600,000 Russian passports in circulation. And all of this technically adheres to the Minsk agreement, for however controversial that might be. So is Russia effectively, over the course of all of this escalation, de-escalation, and diplomatic negotiation, getting what it wants in eastern Ukraine?
No, it's not. This is not a frozen conflict. In other areas that have been raised recently by the NATO Secretary General, they discussed Russia's presence in other conflict areas, which are frozen conflicts. There is no daily bombardment. There's no loss of life. In our press, we've heard over the last few weeks about the 14,000 people who have died in the Donbass conflict, as if they were soldiers. They weren't. They were largely civilians, and a great many of them were the victims of shelling by the Ukrainian forces. So Russia cannot possibly be happy with that going forward. If the bombardments continue, then that represents a failure of Russian policy, not a success. Therefore, they are looking for, at the minimum, pacification, and at a maximum, some of the points that your other guests have raised.
Okay. If Dana and Sergei, if you had a very important comment to make, go ahead. If not, I'd like to move on to another very important issue in all of this. Let me move on then.
I just think if you offer me the chance, I would just say the harder Putin has pushed in Ukraine, the more he has alienated the general population, and a lot of the pro-Russian views, and there are many of them, have become more and more distant because people have felt that Russia is not a friend but a bully next door. And the more militarization on the border, the more evident that becomes.
Okay. Let me move on then. Sergei, I can come to you on this. The meeting that we witnessed just recently with President Biden and Olaf Scholz, the German chancellor, just less than a week ago, the German foreign ministry had said it would stop the Nord Stream 2 pipeline if Russia invaded Ukraine. Biden picked up on that as a strong warning toward Putin. And now Chancellor Scholz seems to be pulling back. Why do you think that is? What's at play here for Germany?
I think it's difficult to say exactly the policy of Germany because it's in a situation of disarray. Germany wants to be part of this Western alliance on one hand, and then Germany has historical experience that it's not good to challenge Russians. It could lead to the dramatically bad results. And Germans remember this fact more than any other nation in Europe. That's why Germany is very, very careful about, for example, supporting of Kiev repressive regime, also because everybody knows that it's a repressive regime. So they are maneuvering, but Russia don't want to be involved too much in this U.S.-German relationship, German-France relationship, German-France relationship. It's not our deal. Our deal is we want to have guarantee of our security. Secondly, we want the project making anti-Russia from Ukraine by using political violence should be stopped.
Okay.
It's not only a case of Donbass. It's the case of people in Odessa and Kharkiv as well. And now colleague told that the issue of language is another issue. No, it's another issue.
Okay.
Russian language, the language of the 80% of the population. And can you imagine that 80% people democratically decided to prohibit on native language?
Okay.
No, it's impossible.
Understood, Sergei. We only have a few minutes left. I want to get everybody else's opinion. And Dana, quickly go ahead.
I mean, he's Sergei Morkov, who I have a lot of respect for, has thrown a lot of things out there about a repressive regime in Kiev, and there are lots of views of how the Ukrainians view the regime in Moscow, and it's a threatening regime to them. The language issues are certainly debatable within Ukraine, and the nationalization of Ukrainian language for Ukrainian identity, and there's a big debate about, should it be a dual language state, but I think where we are is he used the word project. That is exactly the terminology that President Putin used in the 700-word essay that he wrote in the summer, which I'm not going to quote to you, but the Russians view this, that this is a project, a Western project in Ukraine, to turn Ukraine against Russia and to use Ukraine as a platform to attack Russia somehow.
Okay.
And that is a very narrow view of what's going on.
And Gilbert, part of that project, I guess, is Putin looking longer term at what he thinks NATO expansion could mean. For example, retaking Crimea back militarily. Is it a legitimate concern from the Russian perspective?
In the Russian space, there is a lot of discussion about the window of opportunity, which explains the timing of Russia's delivery of its ultimatum on December 15th to Washington. Within Russia, there's a sense that they have a tactical and strategic military superiority. At the very minimum, they are peer equals, and possibly they are in a superior position to the United States and NATO as a whole. But this will not go on forever. They give themselves 2 or 3 years of remaining ahead in armaments and capabilities. It's also the timeline of the Russian president, whose next election, if he decides to participate in it, is in 2024. Within these 2 years, Mr. Putin wants to see this existential threat to his country resolved so that he can retire in peace. Therefore, when you have people saying that there should be negotiated in a 2-year time frame or a 3-year time frame at various levels between Russia and its various partners and talking partners in the West, they're missing the point of the urgency as it's seen from the Russian side, and the schedule, the countdown to resolve the revision of the architecture of security in Europe.
Okay. But I mean, Gilbert, just very quickly, does Russia at this point have a right to see NATO and its expansion as an instigator? It's supposed to be defensive, but they see this encroachment very logically as an affront on its national security. And it shouldn't even exist anymore, according to Russia.
Tired as he was last night at the press conference, which began at 12 o'clock midnight Moscow time, President Putin said several times, a direct answer to your point, that it's impossible to view NATO as a defensive organization or as a political organization rather than as a military and potentially offensive organization, as it demonstrated by its out-of-area campaigns over the last 10 years.
Okay.
Or going back further, as it demonstrated in the bombing of Serbia, of Belgrade, back at the end of 1999.
Okay.
Then the Syrian campaign, most recently, and the Afghan campaign. These are all out of area and certainly not defensive activities.
Okay, Gilbert, we're going to have to leave you with the last word. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us, and our viewers, of course, for tuning in as well. Remember to follow us on Twitter @_Newsmakers, and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.